Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are located. Welcome to the fourth webinar series, Climate Resilient Water Management Approaches, Adaptation in an Age of Uncertainty. My name is Anil Mishra from UNESCO's Intergovernmental Hydrological Program. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you in this fourth series of the webinar organized by UNESCO Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, AGWA, Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and UNESCO Category 2 Center, International Center for Integrated Water Source Management, based in the United States. The webinar we have started to organize last year with the idea to have a global conference on global climate resilient water management approaches. However, COVID-19 did not allow us to organize the global conference that we wanted to welcome all of you here in Paris. And still today, we are not able to organize the conference, but instead we went on and started organizing series of webinars so that we can understand what are the bottom-up needs, what are the bottom-up approaches, and how we can really address the climate change issues and how we can contribute to the climate and development goals that needs to be achieved by 2030. Last year, 2020 was unprecedented, and that forced us to have move into virtual environment. Now there are vaccine rolling out to address the the coronavirus effect. But for climate change, there is no vaccine. Last year was also one of the hottest year in record, and climate impacts is felt everywhere, from melting glaciers, extreme weather, frequency of floods and droughts we have witnessed everywhere. So we are trying to understand what are the local needs, what are the local approaches that allows us to address and make the society resilient. Understanding those local needs and approaches will make informed decision making, and will also allow to avoid uncertainty in climate informed decision making. So in the today's series, fourth series, our title is Facing Uncertainty in Water Management from Urban Water Supply to Agriculture. We will have a speaker from Asian Institute of Technology, Professor Mukand Babel, who will guide us through the topic on climate risk informed decision analysis for addressing water supply challenges in Asia. Followed by a second talk, we will have a valuing variability concept that offers new perspective on using water variability for food production in sub-Saharan Africa by Saviero Cratili from Brescia program of the University of Southampton. We will have also speakers who will feed into the discussion. The program is organized by UNESCO, ICIWaRM, and AGWA, and I would like to thank all the co-organizers for providing their support. And I would like to invite participants to also submit their interest. We are going to also have a publication out of this webinar. We will be calling you to submit your concept so that we can come up with the technical publication to understand what are the bottom-up approaches that you are applying or you want to apply. And hopefully we will be able to organize a global conference later this year if these physical restrictions will be removed. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Will Logan, Director of Integrated Water Sources, ICIWaRM Center, to moderate the session.
Can you hear me?
Will, are you here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's wonderful. Yes. My name's Logan, and Anil, would you like me to introduce the first speaker?
Yes, please.
Excellent. Well, we're very grateful for everyone who is here. And our first speaker is someone who has been working with us for many years now, Dr. Mukand Babel at the Asian Institute of Technology, where I spent 3 months many years ago. And he is a full professor of water engineering and management, and is very involved in climate change Asia and many advisory committees. With that, he's going to speak about 2 different case studies of climate resilience in urban water supply under uncertainties. Dr. Babel?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Thank you, Will. Thank you for this quick introduction. And it's my pleasure to contribute to this webinar series organized by UNESCO, AGWA, and ICIWaRM. And it's good that Will spend some time in Asian Institute of Technology. So I would try to remind him what is all about now after so many years. And I'll be about to share my screen, and then I'll make a presentation at least on presenting 2 case studies, one from Colombo, Sri Lanka, and other from Bangkok, Thailand. So let me share my screen and I hope you can see the screen.
Yes, we can.
Yes. So I'll be supported by 2 of my former students, Miss Upeakshika and Rachel, during the Q&A session. So I'll start with kind of bringing you to a quote, which is known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. This is how I would like to start with, that we know something, we say that we know that. Sometimes we say that we now know, we do not know. But there are things which we do not know, we don't know. So this is how we start with these uncertainties. And my presentation would start with giving a quick setting the scene, which would not take much time. Vulnerability assessment, looking into this top-down and bottom-up approaches. Again, it has been mentioned by Anil, so I will spend a few minutes here, and also trying to spend more time on CRIDA applications in Colombo and Bangkok, and giving you some way forward thinking. So starting with, again, Anil has mentioned, there are 3 landmark agreements which were happened in 2015. All these 3 landmark agreements, the climate risk is at the core of those 3 actions and agreements which took place. If we look into the temperature, as again Anil has taken my slide by speaking that the 2020 was the hottest year on record. But if we say that last 6 years from 2015, every year is becoming the hotter than the previous year. So these 6 years have been the warmest year on record. How the precipitation has changed, if you look into the rate of change over 1951 to 2010, this change has been higher than the change in the past period. But very interestingly, if we see that this is the study reported in 2018, saying that half of the world's annual precipitation falls in just 12 days, and climate change likely to make global precipitation even more uneven. And that's the message I would like you to take home. Now look at the urban water sector. There are top 20 cities with the largest urban water deficit in 2050s. Almost about 3.5 to 4 billion people globally will live with limited access to water. And one-fourth of the about 500 cities will face water shortages in by 2050s. Now, we have a double trouble in terms of not only climate, but non-climatic uh, drivers uh, would also increase the impact. There is a cascading impact effect, and on top of it, what really unexpectedly happened, which was not planned, this COVID-19, which really has disturbed and really put this climate attributed risk at a back foot at this time. What we should also understand that there is a acceptable level of climate and water risk. We have to deal with a certain level that we can manage that risk, and there is an unmanaged part of that risk, which with that, the top-down approaches, as we all know, most of our participants know that how the top-down approaches really bring in the uncertainties at every stage, and that accumulates and cascading effect of uncertainties really make the adaptation questionable. Now, bottom-up approaches where we really look into involving the stakeholders from the beginning. Again, many of the participants who have attended the past webinars are aware of these bottom-up approaches. One of them is CRIDA, and CRIDA approach has got 5 steps, again, starting with the decision context, bottom-up vulnerability assessment, formulating the robust and flexible actions, and evaluating those alternatives, and then implementing them and institutionalizing them. So this is how this CRIDA is. Now we have started this kind of bottom-up approaches to climate change adaptation in AIT, and especially with respect to last 15, 20 years, a lot of research have been done. Just to give an example, almost 200 master's and PhD theses done on climate change impact and adaptation related research. But specifically to CRIDA applications, there are, I have shown here 4 such researches which I'm going to speak on. Out of these 4, on 2. Now the first case study is on how we have looked at this water supply, municipal water supply in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka is a small island country, as we all know. The population of Colombo city, which is the capital city, is about 2 million, and it contributes about 50% of GDP. Now, this water supply to this city comes from a river called Kelani River, and the capacity of the treatment plant is about 550,000 cubic meters per day. Now, the raw water requirement of about 45 cubic meters per second. So we should keep in mind this Kelani River drains into the Indian Ocean. This is the overall methodology of this particular case study. This is a master's thesis done at AIT, where we developed these critical thresholds of the system, and then we had this modeling of future climate and future flows using a hydrologic model for the stress test analysis. Then we had the adaptation options identified, and then recommendations were made. So the main point which I would like to, through this particular slide, want to say that the system thresholds, main system threshold is with respect to the required flow at the intake point of 45 cubic meters per second. And what we did is that we look into the future future climate, future rainfall, future flows in the river, and the future demand of the city with respect to three scenarios which were developed here. And we have analyzed the corresponding flow requirement at the intake point. And then we look into how many number of days the failure happens, where we are not able to pump enough water, we are not able to supply enough water. And then you can see on the graph here on the left side that how this number of days in case of baseline period and these three scenarios of next 30 years from 2030 to 2059. And you see that the number of days of failures have reduced because of increased flow in the river under future climatic conditions. But interestingly, we will see in the next slide that that number of days of failures in a particular year, and we divide it into four ranges in terms of risk, what kind of risk we are facing in this particular case, with low to moderate to high and very high. And we would see that under these three scenarios of future flows where flows are increased, we still have number of days of failure happening. And in terms of frequency of failure also shown here on the right side. We also try to see that what could happen if water demand reduction strategy is followed. So we developed three scenarios and the details are given in this particular table, where ABC is the three scenarios where how the demand reduction is happening over the period of time, and correspondingly what is the number of days of failure happening. So you see the scenario 1, 2, 3 and the scenario ABC. The number of days have reduced, more or less, not big difference because of this. We have also projected the future population here. But then if you see here, the frequency of failure is happening with respect to high and very high risk of failure. Now, we also try to understand this with respect to what really will happen if we would like to go for a zero risk situation. Then in year of 2040 to 2044 and 2055 to 2059, we cannot. We just have, we can meet the demand of about 70 liters per day. But if we keep this demand to up to 150, then these are the two periods where we have to really think what is the adaptation. So we looked into many adaptations which are listed here with respect to per capita demand reduction and overall demand reduction, where reduction of non-revenue water of about more than 30%, which happens in this particular case, has to be considered. So bringing it you to the conclusions at this stage, that we found that the climate related issue faced by Colombo water supply system is mainly the shortage of water, especially during the dry season at the intake point. And in future, although both rainfall and river flows are expected to increase, but even with that, there is a high risk of system failure. So demand management measures, which we are now currently looking into analyzing them with respect to cost benefit and also their implementation. The case study 2 is on climate change adaptation in municipal water supply of Bangkok. And you will see that this is more complex system here compared to the first case, which is from Colombo. Here, the Bangkok city is almost 8 to 9 million people, more than 2.5 connections, water connections. The water production is almost 5 million cubic meters per day. And interestingly, the Bangkok location is towards the downstream of a river system, which is called Chao Phraya River system, which is covering almost 1/3 of the country geographical area. And there are two big reservoirs, which are called Bhumipol and Sirikit reservoirs, supplying not only water to the city, but also producing electricity and flood control. These are multiple purpose infrastructure there. The interesting part is that the pumping is happening at about 97 kilometers upstream from the river mouth. So salinity is an issue. So we had this is our overall methodology, little bit different than what CRIDA framework is. Here we analyze the critical threshold. That is the first thing. The second thing is we looked into the future by changing the linearly the historical data we used to develop those stress tests, and then we established various scenarios of combination of these shifts in terms of three main critical performance metrics in terms of flow, salinity, and the turbidity. And then we come up with some adaptation solutions. Now, the stakeholder consultation was done, and we found that the flow at a particular station, which is called scene 29, if it is below 80 cubic meters per second, then the salinity will intrude in the system from the Gulf of Thailand. The salinity at a point which is near to the pumping station, which is shown on this graph here, it says that if salinity exceeds 0.25 grams per liter, then there is a reduction in the plant operation, the treatment plant operation, and if it goes beyond 0.5 grams per liter, then the critical conditions reaches. And then turbidity exceeding 200 NTU would increase the cost of treatment, and it will take longer to process the water for supply. Now here we try to understand the past. So we look into what really has happened in the past, and what are the relations with respect to river flows and the salinity, and river flows, high river flows, and the turbidity, which is very clear from this that the low flows are highly related to high salinity because of the saltwater intrusion, and high river flows are related to the high turbidity here. Now this is also very clear from the from this particular graph here, which shows the flow and the salinity. And then this is flow at a particular station, C29, and the turbidity at C55. Now here, interestingly, if you see here, you will see that the no action is required at 80% of time. And when the flow is low, then the salinity will be high, and we need to have action number one, which is about 14% of time. So this particular understanding of this complexity, that where the flows are low because of the upstream water use, and flows are high during the rainy season, you have high turbidity, and that really makes this system very, very complex in terms of understanding. So what we did is we try to understand again from very similar approach that how many days the failure occurs in a particular year. So we, just for 6 years, I have shown the results here, that in a particular, like this 2013, 14, and 15 were very, really critical in terms of flows were low. So 136 days in a year of 2015, the system could not have flow, or river could not have flow of 80 cubic meters per second. Similarly, on salinity side, 31 days the system failed because of salinity. Now we try to vary these variables, like this performance metrics in terms of flow, salinity, and turbidity by 10% reduce 20% reduction, 30% reduction, and similarly we increase 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 to see that how what is the system failure occurs. And we can see that obviously as we see the flow is increased, number of days of failure will reduce, which is understandable. But at the same time, if you see the salinity, if it is increased by 20% or 30%, 40%, number of days are really getting higher and higher, up to almost with 50% increase of 100 days failure. Now here, this is the crux of the analysis, where we try to change the these performance metrics in terms of flow and salinity together to see. And now from this particular analysis, you can see that with current salinity, even if flow is increased by 50%, there will still be about 35 days of failure will happen. And if salinity increases by 50%, which is likely to happen because there is another research we are doing, that what would be the future sea level in this particular location would cause what kind of situation in terms of salinity in this. And we found that even with the flow is increased to 50%, there will be still 100 days of failure going to happen. So salinity is very critical in this particular case. So with that, this is a very complex system at risk, where Bangkok water supply heavily depend on these river flows, the salinity and sediment, all three together. The combined effect of sea level rise and land subsidence, which is also an issue in Bangkok, where a lot of groundwater pumping took place in the past. So land subsidence, and which increases the not only flooding at one side, but also especially with respect to this study, there is an increase in salinity, which cannot be reduced even with the increased flow of 50% in the river. That really forces us to think what are the adaptation solutions. So of course, one of them is shifting the raw water intake upstream, which is seriously thought by the water supply utility also, and seawater desalinization, interbasin transfer, which is now started basically. With respect to turbidity, we need to enhance our soil and water conservation efforts in the watersheds. And what we could not do as a part of this study, which is now being done, is a detailed hydrologic modeling study of upper watersheds to really project the actual or expected river flows in the future, and the hydrodynamic modeling of the lower part of this river section to see the dynamics of river flow, salinity, and sediment. So this is the conclusion, but I would like to spend 1 or 2 more minutes on looking into way forward. So we would like to look into one of the very interesting idea which came in, is to evaluate these adaptation measures from the perspective of carbon neutrality. That what is the, of course they are good for adaptation, but are they good for mitigation in terms of carbon emission? Of course, economic analysis, considering the societal and environmental cost, which is not really taken into consideration. Developing these adaptation pathways, considering all these three aspects of adaptation measures, carbon neutrality, and the cost benefit or economic analysis. Bangkok can think of going for a salinity barrier, which is a gray infrastructure, but it is a possibility to look into. How do we really institutionalize this adaptation from bottom-up approach? That's a challenge. Which now the third and fourth point is with respect to subjectivity, which we bring in through this stakeholder consultation process, because most of the consultations are based on the experiences of these stakeholders from the past. And how do we really bring in these emerging and new challenges which might come? We also would like to think way forward in terms of applying this CRIDA for the whole urban water cycle, considering water supply, wastewater, and complete cycle. there is a huge potential of utilizing this big data and artificial intelligence technologies for vulnerability assessment. So with that, I would like to conclude my my presentation, my case study presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That's a lot of material, and I look forward to reading more about it. Is some of this going to be published?
Yes, we are working on both papers, basically. One in Climate Risk Management Journal and other is in International Water Resource Development. We are working on it now.
Fantastic. I'd like to invite your co-authors first, just to see if they would wish to add anything to what you said. Perhaps first, Yasas, Upeakshika. Was that Colombo?
Yeah, hi. No, I think Professor Babel covered like about everything, so I'll be happy to answer if you have any questions.
Well, I like that example a lot precisely because it's not too complicated. Everything is complicated, of course, when you look at it, but sometimes I think people look at what we're doing here and they say, I don't know where to start. You know, that's just too much. And I believe you did the Colombo study as part of your degree at AIT, is that correct?
Yeah, part of my thesis.
Fantastic. And then also for the Bangkok example, do we have Rachel Isito on the line today?
Yeah, hi, I'm here. Can you hear me?
So that is a fascinating example because of all of the different the different metrics, and yet they're related as variables. How did you decide to? How did you choose those variables? And a related question: how? If you could tell us a little more about the stakeholder, how that works.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much for the questions. So I think Professor Babel did a very good job in going through everything. So the thing that we would like to highlight about our study in particular is that we do not use the conventional CRIDA framework. We actually did a modification. So the benefit of this is that it's rather simplistic. Therefore, you don't need like a complicated, complex model because, as mentioned, the Thailand system is very complex. So we are not able to model it yet. So somebody is working on it, but we haven't gotten a model yet. So the thing about our model is that it started off with the stakeholders consultation. So right from the beginning, we engaged the Metropolitan Waterworks Authority of Thailand, that's the MWA. So we did a few rounds of interview with them, and then they helped us to identify like exactly what were the problems that they were facing. So as a water utility, you either face water quantity issues or water quality issues. In terms of quantity, they weren't facing much because in Thailand, they received the first priority in terms of water allocation. Whereas for water quality, they are facing problems like salinity because of the saltwater intrusion from the downstream Gulf of Thailand, and also turbidity when they get like sediments and all those things from the upstream. So that was how we identified the different problems for the site-specific study. Yep, and then subsequently we realized that, we don't have a model, so we need to consider everything from a climate change perspective. There are many things that actually affect things like the flow, salinity, and turbidity. So you have rainfall, precipitation, temperature, evaporation, and whatnots, which we are not able to really capture in a complex system. So why not we just go straight to the performance matrix itself? So we have the turbidity and the salinity. So let's vary it, because in the future it might vary. Based on several studies, the salinity will increase by at least a few 10-20% in the future. So that was how we managed to carry out our study. And then we look at how things might vary in the future and how the utility is at risk. So we are still moving ahead to see how we can actually work with the utility to, yeah, to deal with all these climate risks. Thank you. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, though I'm always interested in how you actually find the stakeholders. How do you decide who are the key stakeholders and how do you contact them? And Rachel, when you finish, perhaps Yasas can also tell us how that worked in Colombo.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, Prof. Babel, as you know, he's well known in Thailand itself. So we managed to get contacts of people within the Metropolitan Water Works Authority. Yep, so initially we did a proposal and then we asked them whether they would like to work with us to look at, yeah, all these problems. So that was how we identified. And also in several case studies, we're looking at stakeholders in terms of like, if we have a particular basin or pond, we have the farmers and all those people. But since the water utility in urban Bangkok itself is managed by MWA, yeah, we decided that they would be the sole stakeholders that we would interview. Yeah, thank you.
So in the Colombo case, actually anyone can be a stakeholder, from the officers, from in the the water, like for my case in the treatment plant, and then up to households as well, like the users. But since Colombo is like a big area, it's difficult to consider all the users, and so it was difficult to go at user level. So in my study also we considered the water supply board, as well as the officers from the water treatment plant. So we considered like distribution managers and like the intake operators and people from the production line. So those were the stakeholders considered in this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In both cases, there was the issue of data scarcity. And I think that, that you addressed that to some extent, but what then, did you use this process, the CRIDA process, then to identify new data needs to be able to take the next steps? And what are the next steps? Perhaps beginning with the Bangkok.
Okay, sorry. If I get your question right, it's how this framework help us to identify the problems and what are the next steps, is it?
What in particular, right, the next steps, especially with respect to data.
With respect to data?
What your needs are in particular, and where do you go from here?
Okay. So, Prof. Babel, he has established a plan forward for this. So right now, I think he has other students who are working on, say, a model, connecting this system, which, as mentioned, we don't have something to connect the stressors, the climate stressors, and the response from the system. So currently, that's the next step forward, I guess. So, Prof. Babel, if you would like to elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, I think what Rachel has said is what we are currently looking into. This complex system, we are trying to model it, and we will have, part of that study. We are again publishing that what would be the future sea level rise going to happen. So we have downscaled the future sea level rise expected, and we have that's We have also bias corrected them, and we are now in process of publishing that work also, that what is expected in next 60 years, 70 years in terms of sea level rise. Now, complexity comes, as I said, that the land subsidence is also a major issue in Bangkok, although it is at a reduced rate now, but still an issue there. So how do we really project what is the sea level rise going to be with respect to the external factors, the global factors, and also the local factors, which are like land subsidence mainly. So we have also looked into what is the expected land subsidence in the future. So this is one part of the uh, work we are working on with a PhD student. Uh, your question is that what we are also now developed a hydrologic model for all this huge watershed of about 150,000 square kilometer, covering the as I said, 1/3 of the country geographical area, to really see the complexity comes that upstream users of water, and there are two big reservoirs, and there's a lot of water I didn't mention in my presentation, but just upstream of this point of intake, the huge water use in agriculture, which is like, that's why it's called the rice bowl of Thailand, the maximum of rice produced there. So that's the one of the major challenges, and one of the questions I see in the Q&A box also, that is it possible to move upstream the intake point? So that is uh, being considered. But there is another solution which is taken up by this MWA to bring water from another river basin nearby, which is called Meklong River Basin, where there is a excessive water available at this time. So there's a lot of investment going in there now. From the research perspective, I would rather look at that which kind of or which type of these adaptation measures are carbon neutral, because we are trying to adapt to the climate change. And we shouldn't be bringing in those adaptation measures which again try to use a lot of energy, for example. So that is a very interesting area of research. I think that's enough, Will, at this time.
Yes, that's perfect, and we're right on schedule. Perhaps Yasas, I don't know if you have something quick, maybe in a minute, to say about the future of the Colombo system.
Yeah, like most of the things Professor Babel said is valid for this case also. Like, for example, considering the saltwater intrusion. So with sea level rise, we might have to consider that also in the future. And apart from that, I would also like to mention, like in the Colombo study, we are considering adaptation measures. So to like for the feasibility of adaptation measures, where one of the main adaptation measure we considered was reduction of per capita demand. So for that, I think we can involve the users as well. So if like moving forward, we can maybe talk to the users directly and get their input, like how they can contribute to reduction of per capita demand. So apart from that, I would like to add this point as well. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for two really interesting examples that are, I'm always amazed at what's going on all around the world. So thank you very much to all our speakers, and with that, we'll shift continents now. We're moving a little west and south, and we're going to have several examples, several case studies. We're calling it the valuing variability concept. It's a little different. It's a bottom-up perspective on using water variability for food production, this time in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have two authors here, two speakers from who are both involved in the so-called Breccia program. Sorry, I have my dog here. And the Breccia program is a very interesting program through the United Kingdom in combination with any number of universities. And non-governmental organizations in Southern Africa. So with that, we'll ask Saverio Grafley to start. He's a freelance researcher and consultant, very interested in science and development, worked a lot with the UN, and is working on the valuing variability concept. And our other speaker, Dr. Fiona Achu, and she's working at the Kenyatta University, also with the Brecha project. And her particular goal here is the research and engagement, the policy-making processes and mechanisms, water and food security. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our, thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. Let me share my screen. So yes, as you said, I will present with my colleague Fiona Ngarachu. I'll do the first 10 minutes and she'll do the second. The last 200 years of fossil fuel-based economic acceleration have eaten the planet and eliminated its biodiversity at an unprecedented pace. Climate change and other anthropogenic phenomena impacting on the natural cycles have made water variability and related uncertainty a global issue. And this is expected to intensify in the coming years. In the context of development, of agricultural development, the response to high levels of variability in the natural environment has always been an effort to increase control, investing in reducing variability while trying to introduce stability. The modernist approach of emancipating agriculture from the vagaries of nature continues to enchant policymakers and donors alike. Efforts in this direction have largely relied on fossil fuel-based solutions, transfer of technology and mechanization schemes, dams and large-scale irrigation, motorized water extraction, chemical and pesticides. Today, in the face of a sustained increase of variability, despite important investments to eliminate it, the scientific debate is divided. Many believe that we need to intensify planning and intensify our efforts to control nature and complete the project of emancipation from it. Others, also many and growing, believe that we need different efforts, centered on a logical working with nature rather than against it, and based on flexibility and real-time management. The valuing variability concept belongs to this group. It is rooted in lessons from regions of the world where extreme water variability is neither a novelty nor an anomaly. And it focuses on the experience and knowledge of small-scale food production systems with a long track record of operating in these conditions, therefore demonstrating significant and empirically tested levels of resilience. In this presentation, we introduce the valuing variability concept and illustrate it with examples from African drylands. But both amongst producers who specialize in animal husbandry and amongst producers who specialize in crop farming. Valuing variability is not a technology. It's not a technology for solving the problem of water variability, more a conceptual framework and a proposal to reflect on the way we engage with this issue. In the drylands, patchy and itinerant rains of varying intensity make it impossible to predict from one year to the next if a crop will mature or grass will grow in a given location. This has always been the case. This is not the result of climate change. Variability is further increased as rainfall combines with other variables. For example, the ways biodiversity or soil or the morphology of the terrain affect absorption and evapotranspiration. Environmental variability is high, both in time and space. from the macro scale of interannual, seasonal, and regional variations, all the way down to the micro scales. Nutrient contents, for example, changes with the life cycle of a plant and between day and night, but also between plant and plant, or even between different parts of the same plant. Users like pastoralists and dryland farmers learn to manage their relationship with the environment over time and space and across scales in order to turn such a restless change into valuable resources. They do so by finding ways of changing at the same pace with the environment, and by keeping their options open to match the uncertain future. Adaptive dryland food systems specialize in achieving lower variability in outputs, but matching the variability in the environment, with variability integrated in their process of production. Whether for farming or for pasture, variability in processes is preferred to stability and uniformity. A variable range of locations, even if relatively uncertain, is preferred to secure access to just one location. Keeping a variety of species in the herd or a variety of crops in the field is preferred to keeping just one. Where variability is the norm, working with variability rather than against it means higher productivity and resilience. Some groups of pastoralists in the Sahel move south at the beginning of the rainy season to meet the rains. Then, as the season progresses, they follow the rains all the way back north to the edge of the Sahara, where pasture is best. This strategy aims to keep the herds on green pasture for longer than it would be possible in any of the locations visited along the way. When successful, this strategy stretches the rainy season in the experience of the animals. Similarly, some farming communities in the dry highlands of northern Ethiopia leave stones in their fields, not for laziness or neglect, but in order to increase the concentration of moisture in case of rain, as a result of reducing the exposed surface. This effectively increases the average rainfall, not in absolute terms, of course, but in the experience of the crop. And the way this is achieved is by introducing variability. Fiona will present several more examples. It is worth emphasizing that the natural environments that matter in relation to people's livelihoods are not the detached ecosystems of geography and natural sciences. Natural resources are usually represented as something out there in a given amount. But this representation of resources as object, it's a shortcut. In reality, the term resource refers to a relationship, a certain relationship between users and something being used. Material things only become resources by virtue of being involved in such a relationship. What matters, therefore, ultimately, is the way the natural environment is experienced by the people who use it. Fertile land is a resource only in relation to agriculture. Oil and coal are resources in relation to fossil fuel economies. A drought is not the same experience for those who can move somewhere else and for those who cannot. A flood is not the same experience if your livelihood depends on recessional agriculture. People's experience of the environment is almost unfailingly mediated by other people, either directly or in the form of social and institutional interfaces. In value and variability, natural resource management is not the management of things, but the management of the relationships that enable certain people to experience certain things as resources. Whilst objects are given, relationships are made and therefore can be modified. Thinking of water resources as relationships leads to questions about all the terms in such relationships. This is who uses what and how. What exactly is being used? Water in what form? What kind of water? When and for how long? Where and why? And how are these relationships socially mediated? Each of these questions opens up variables and options, and such options can be mobilized in managing the relationship that make water a resource. Important differences often only exist in the detail. For example, from the perspective of the users, that is a bottom-up perspective, rain is not a resource unless its distribution can somehow be harnessed. Runoff water is not a resource unless it collects somewhere. Livestock and crops are part of people's ways of collecting water. In pastoralism, mobility is crucial to the making of water as a resource. Sometimes water in the form of moisture, even if only in the air, can be sufficient. Valuable opportunities can be small, scattered, and short-lived. Often, forms of use that are just in time or just for now are sufficient. An intimate knowledge of the landscape by people and animals, down to the morphology of the terrain and its biodiversity at micro level, can make a big difference. But not without the appropriate social and institutional infrastructure. Institutions for shared, diversified, and negotiable access can play an important role in the making of water as a resource. In dry areas where there is no access to land, without access to water, the management of the relationship that make water into a resource is strictly connected to the management of the relationships that make land into a resource. Let me recall the key elements of value and variability before I conclude. First of all, whether variability in the natural environment is experienced as an obstacle or an opportunity for food production depends on the production system. It's not inherent to the system, to the ecosystem. Drylands food systems aim to lower variability in outputs by matching the variability in the natural environment with variability in the processes of production. And finally, opportunities and risk can only be defined from the perspective of the users in the here and now. There are also two important implications. Thriving on variability is possible, and indeed many professions specialize in doing so. Think of finance, international trade, or even the pharmaceutical industry. And the second implication is that interventions that reduce the variability in the processes of production lead to higher variability in outputs. Valuing variability builds on users' intimate knowledge of the landscape, on their operational logic, and on their specialist institutions. Valuing variability harnesses the opportunities that often exist only at the scale of actual producers, but that are neither possible or visible at higher scales. For example, they're not captured in average values, such as annual rainfall, or in feed balance, or even the length of the growing season. And finally, the shift of focus from resources as things to resources as relationships, again, a bottom-up perspective, unlocks alternative ways of understanding problems and a much wider range of resource management options. My colleague, Fiona Ngaracho, will now illustrate the value and variability concept with a range of examples from the field. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you very much, Saverio. Just on this first slide, I think it's important for us to know what BRECHA actually means. So this is building research capacity for sustainable food and water security in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a 4-year project funded through GCRF UKRI. We're actually in the final year of this project, and it's in 4 countries, Malawi, Ghana, Kenya, and the UK, and I'll be using 3 of those as part of my illustration. Thank you. So the case studies I'm going to talk about are very brief, just to illustrate the background that Saverio has given you. So one will be Wajir in Kenya. You can see there on the map, it's in northeastern Kenya, very arid area of the country. The second would be Kitui in the southeastern area of Kenya, which is a semi-arid area with mainly agriculture as the main activity there, with Wajir being pastoralism. And lastly, we're going to have a brief example from North Kordofan in Sudan. And I'll be using examples from Malawi and Ghana, our BRECHA partner countries as well. So next slide. So firstly, in Wajir, I want to explain this, water pans that are used there by pastoralists to water their animals and also for local domestic use. So water pans, for those who are not familiar, is this small reservoir that's created by excavating open ground to collect and store surface runoff from open rangelands. And really how this relates to variability here is it's used to stretch, so to speak, the rainy season. So during the rainy season, this water collects in the water pans and is stored there and enables pastoralists to continue moving around and utilizing this water for their animals. So we're working with variable rainfall and pastoralist mobility, and I'm trying to understand the dynamics really between the dry season and the wet season. So trying to stretch the rainy season as far as possible into the dry season to allow pastoralists to continue moving around, watering their animals and living their lives in essence. So really it's creating a relative stability, so to speak. So you're not trying to control the rainfall, it's variable either way, but you're creating that kind of relative stability and really understanding those dynamics. And really one other thing that's happening with the water pans as well is managing and regulating through the communities, through fencing, so that the water pans are we're able to regulate the number of animals that come in, they're not churning up the mud and basically destroying the water pan. So my second example comes from Kitui in Kenya. And the two examples there, one is road water harvesting and the other is sand dams. So road water harvesting does have some parallels to spate irrigation, but really is utilizing runoff from the higher lying areas and from the roadways that are being both existing and being constructed currently in Kitui through digging, if you can see in the picture there on the side, culverts and water channels that go to the lower lying farm, which is right at the end of that picture. And in the farms, what they dig is pits and water channels within the farm so the water can run off during the rainy season and also water ponds be able to be conserved and stretch again the rainy season, similar to the pastoralist example I gave in Wajir, and be able to provide water for longer for those particular farming activities. And the sand dams can be small and larger scale, although what I experienced in Kitui was more of the smaller scale ones. And what these are, this is a seasonal river in Kitui, it's the Wasonyiro River. And what happens is when the river is not in flow, communities and sometimes even individuals dig these embankments, as you can see over there, at the side of the river. And also within those embankments, as you can see down there in the photo, dig little channels and little holes where water collects. When the river is not in flow, they're able to conserve that water and use it for both domestic use and for watering their animals. So these are two examples in Kitui that we can see of communities working really with the resources they have and working with, not trying to, basically control a river. The river is seasonal, but utilizing it as much as possible for their particular needs. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, it's coming. Yes, so the next example is in Malawi, and this focuses on soil moisture conservation. And this tree, Fadebia albida, is really indigenous to most of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's really used in traditional agroforestry. This is just one example I gave. There are very many other trees and plants and herbs and bushes that are used in this particular way. So what happens is this tree loses its leaves in the wet season. And providing mulch for the crops, underneath. And you see, it's not really competing for moisture with the plants as well, because it gets its water during the rainy season when there is water to be had, but then gives its leaves as moisture. And also in the dry season, it provides, those leaves provide, fodder for the livestock. And you can have the next slide. So next slide is also on soil moisture conservation, and this is also in Ghana, one of our partner countries. My colleague actually took this photo, and this is an illustration of what Severio was talking about. sorry, just go back, Severio, the stone bunding or leaving stones in the fields. So if you can squint and see in the photo, you'll see there are rows of stones in the fields that have been put there by communities or by farmers to help conserve moisture and conserve the runoff in the water. So this is an example of maybe a bit larger stones and put in systematic rows. Sometimes you can use smaller ones, as Severio mentioned. And this was in the Talensi region in Upper East region of Ghana. And again, going back to what Severio explained, this is about increasing really rainfall or moisture at the very much micro scale. In one particular farm, you're not necessarily trying to do this at a much larger scale. Next slide, thank you. And my last example will be in Sudan, in North Kordofan, where this is from the article, a book called Standing Wealth. And in this region, there was an issue, obviously, with access to water by pastoralists, and more specifically pastoralists. And initially, the solution that had been proposed is, these pastoralists need to settle down. We need to provide, boreholes or water, fixed water points for them. There's no other particular solution. So this was a variable, so to speak, a solution kind of taking variability into account by using these what are called portable water bladders that can hold a certain amount of water, be transported on a camel or on a truck, and actually follow the pastoralists as they go along in their movement and looking for pasture within their movements. So what you have here is you're not sedentarizing them. You're not kind of having a fixed water point where there might be issues of land degradation, of conflict, but the resource is actually moving with them and kind of solving the issue of, we need water, this is how we're going to provide the water. Next slide, please. So yes, the previous assumption, as I said, was, the water has to be local and fixed. And so the portable water points or portable water bladders are matching the access of water with the selective and transient use of pasture made possible by strategic mobility. And again, as Severio has said, we're trying to match the variable process and the variable input to have, the successful environmental variability or use of environmental variability for successful community so all we are over and above the examples I've mentioned, there is ways that we're trying to internalize this concept within our project and wider. So one thing that we're doing as part of the BRECHA project is developing a curriculum using this concept of varying variability at the university level. And we are doing it in 3 ways. So first is an undergraduate course. This is an existing course. That's why we're calling it undergraduate course enhancement. So there are existing courses at Kenyatta University, which is going to be used as the pilot. Around one course is called Arid and Semi-Arid Lands, that actually focuses on understanding the ASALs. And what we're going to be trying to do is integrating these concepts of variability and examples and case studies, perhaps even going to the field with the students to get them to try and internalize and understand these concepts, because these are the students that are going to be going on and working in policy, in government, in practice, and we need them to kind of understand and appreciate this particular concept, both at undergraduate and postgraduate level. But also very importantly, we are designing, in the process of designing, a short course, a short 2-week course that will be targeting current policymakers. There is a lot around policy in Kenya, especially around the arid and semi-arid lands. There's an ASAL policy that was formulated in 2017, which does, to some extent, recognize this. For example, I'll give a quote. Pastoralists have successfully managed climate variability for centuries. Their skills and indigenous knowledge is invaluable to climate adaptation. So we do have policies that are starting to recognize this variability, but we need to also take it a bit more forward. Next slide, which I believe is the last one. So in conclusion, really just a couple of questions to spark discussion. Questions that don't really also have answers. So when we talk about the drylands, we talk about water scarcity. Is there really scarcity in the drylands? Do we need to rethink this issue of scarcity? And is it maybe how we define scarcity is the problem to begin with? Obviously, as we've been talking about through this whole presentation, it really starts from local people and sometimes look at opportunities at the micro scale, which is hard to replicate or see at the macro scale. And also, can we actually at the very beginning embed variability in policy? Because if we talk about variability in the system, then the policy needs to directly respond to that. Thank you. Those are just some links for the literature. Thank you.
Well, that was fascinating. Thank you to both of you. You're doing an amazing amount of work. I don't know how you have done all that. But one of the very interesting things, of course, is that most of the previous talks, not just today, but earlier, in earlier webinars have been very urban, and it's quite refreshing to see this at a different scale. So we do have a number of questions, and I hope these questions, Alex, will be preserved in some way, because there are a lot of questions and answers in there. But one of them was, how do you balance short-term productivity with long-term resilience? There are, of course, immediate needs for the agricultural producers and pastoralists. What kinds of trade-offs are there in the short term and the long term?
I didn't get the question. I'm sorry. The sound was coming and going, and
I'm sorry. That's my speaker. How do you balance short-term productivity with long-term resilience?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, unless the reference to productivity is a reference to a project of increasing productivity. If it's a project of increasing productivity, well, that's been a global project for a very long time, and it looks like you can't balance it, and that's why we have climate change. If it's a matter of stabilizing productivity, so if the question refers to what we said about lowering outputs, then lowering outputs is part of what makes the system resilient. In that case, I don't think the two objectives are to be balanced. They are going very much in the same direction. I'm not sure whether I have answered that question. Fiona, maybe you have understood it differently and might want to add something.
Not at this time. Yeah, I'll just say not at this time. I think you've answered it quite adequately.
Okay, a more scientific question. How do you measure or quantify variability in your case?
Again, why do we need to measure it, and what is the value of measuring it?
Yeah.
In that case, the value is much more in matching it. Mm-hmm. From the perspective of the users, I doubt very much that they need to measure it.
Exactly, I completely agree. I was going to say, we're not really measuring variability, and you almost can't measure it, so to speak, especially when you're looking, as Severia said, from the perspective of the pastoralist. They're not going to measure the variability. They're going to, at this stage, they're not going to tell you we get this much rainfall a year. That figure doesn't really matter to them, so to speak.
Also, variability is relevant in that case to the extent to which it results in uncertainty. It prevents prediction. So in as much as it prevent prediction, that's variability. Then you don't need to know how much it prevents prediction. You just can't predict. So as you can't predict, you have to replace knowledge with options. And that's where their strategy starts.
Thank you. Switching a little bit now to a water quality question. Someone was asking if you could speak a little more to the relationship between the river salinity and the agricultural productivity in some of these cases. So is it just in this case a water quantity issue, or are there water quality issues?
Fiona, may I go first?
Yeah.
I would say that is generally within a value and variability approach is very much about quality. but quality in the sense of differences in kind, not differences in degree. So not better quality, worse quality, but different kinds of water. That's why we talked about moisture. We talked about watering vegetation, and also when. These differences, which are, and that is absolutely essential, are very much in time and in scale and in space, are differences of kind. And when you start looking at the way people make parts of their environment into a resource, then you have abandoned the reasoning based on abstract concepts like water, and you start looking at effectively what are people and animal using and when, and in the here and there. So yes, the answer is that there is a lot of attention for quality in a multi-dimensional way, not just the traditional attention for quality, which is, you know, clean or dirty, or more or less, or better or worse. Some animals don't like cold water, and you know, they get ill. That's you know, it's 50 degrees in the shade. If they have access to cold water, say from a very deep well, it's a problem. So it's not as good as a shallow well. Some people don't like water that smells of bleach or is a bit salty, and they'd rather have it from a pond. I met them personally in Karamoja and in Turkana, because the other one just doesn't taste right. It's when you look at the perspective from the perspective of the user, then what is a resource only depends on them and how they use it and when, and yeah. So quality is based at that level.
And I just wanted to add on that it also goes back to policy and planning. And one thing I didn't mention about Wajir is, you know, as of the last policy document in 2018, there are 272 boreholes. And there are a lot of studies right now, there's GIS mapping happening, and what that's identified is a lot of those are actually non-operational and or saline, because digging a borehole is also a political tool and a political resource. So, you know, I come in as a politician, I dig a borehole, yay, I've done something for my community. But it's about, yes, boreholes are important. They do have their uses in dryland areas, but it's about, you know, communicating with the community as well, communicating with the pastoralists. What do they actually need at that particular time? And something that Severi actually told me, do you need a lot of water? Do you need enough water? So that's kind of going back to the water quality. You don't need to hoard that resource, but you do need enough water or just sufficient water. Thanks.
In that sense, one could say that there is a political quality to water as well.
Yeah, yep, absolutely.
I'm curious as to, again, since most of the previous talks in this series have been urban oriented, and we think of stakeholders such as, you know, the urban, the potable water users, and might be some hydropower industries and things like that. This is so different. When one talks about stakeholders in your project, who are the stakeholders, and are there different levels or kinds of stakeholders?
Absolutely. I think in any project, you have different levels and different kinds. So in our project, we have stakeholders all the way from the top, meaning government officials, you know, the governors themselves, the policymakers, people working in government on food and water security issues. But then we also have the mid-level, so to speak, influencers. These are non-governmental organizations, classified donor organizations there as well, which do have quite a high impact in the areas that we work in. And all the way to the local community. So for example, the actual pastoralists, the actual water users, those are considered part and parcel of our key stakeholders. And what as a project that we've done really is in our research, you know, embed stakeholder perspectives in all that we are doing. So for example, we have sub-research projects within the larger projects. So our research fellows are given the opportunity to create their own sub-research projects in areas that interest them. I'm interested in policy, so I have my own sub-research project around policy in food and water security. And in that, one of the key things is to go out and find, okay, I'm not just going to research on this. What are the key issues around there from the stakeholders' perspective? So from the communities, for me, I work more with government officials in food and water security. What are their perspectives? What are their needs? So I would say you do have to have stakeholders at almost every single level, depending on what your project is, really, unless Severi wants to add on to that.
No, I think that's very comprehensive answer.
So what we, maybe I can add on to that, what we did at the very beginning is a stakeholder mapping, as a lot of projects do. And we have had a lot of engagements, I mean, limited now because of COVID, but online as much as we can do to kind of keep that relationship going. I'll just mention that one of the key things stakeholders told us in the beginning is we feel that we're consulted at the beginning and then given results at the end. But what about, as you go along all through? So that's what we try to do with having a project where it's just not one big research question and one big project. We have about 24 what we call small research projects or sub-projects that are run by early career researchers and research fellows. So at that kind of more micro scale gives us an opportunity to engage more directly with stakeholders. Yeah.
And since a lot of the research is being done at places like Kenyatta University in the big city, I assume what you're saying is the researchers have to get back into the field from time to time.
Yes, but we also do work with not only the communities, but various partners that are perhaps more field-based. For example, for my example, we have worked with Southeastern University that's based in the field in Kitui. So they have, at least a bit more of a grounded perspective than I would have at Kenyatta University. And we are coming up with ways to kind of get around, so to speak, having to go to the field because of COVID. But yeah, we have had a lot of field-based activities and having to go and speak to communities or engaging with communities, yeah.
Excellent. I'd like to ask Alex Roner of Agua. He's been following the chat and the question and answer sessions here. And I don't know, Alex, if there are some of the questions and chat items that have been brought up that were answered just in the chat that you think were worth a little discussion here with the group.
Thanks, Will. We've received a great number of questions from you all, so thanks again for engaging with us and with the speakers. I think the only recurring trend worth mentioning is just what Fiona touched on, and the need for stakeholder engagement in both of these presentations was really paramount, and stakeholder engagement at multiple levels from the presentation just given, extremely localized knowledge and engagement is needed all the way up to the ministerial level when you're talking about policy processes that need to be put in place. So and how you select the stakeholders that you're engaging with is just as important as bringing them to the table, because they all have different interests and perspectives. So that stakeholder engagement should also be maybe an iterative process where you're coming back to the same stakeholders, making sure that you, as Fiona just mentioned, adequately represented their interest in the project, and also making sure to always have open seats at the table to engage with other groups too that may have been neglected in the first round. But other than that, I think the presenters did a great job of getting to all the questions, and thanks again to all the attendees for being so active.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I believe Anil Mishra from UNESCO is back on the call. I don't know if he's monitoring. Oh, there he is. Anil, I know you weren't able to hear all the talks, but if you want to say a word or two.
Well, thank you very much, Will, for moderating and facilitating fantastic discussion. Of course, I was not able to follow all the presentation and discussion because of other ongoing meeting here in UNESCO. But as I said in my opening statement, our interest is to really understand the application of bottom-up approaches in different regions so that we can compile case studies. So I would like to invite audience to submit their interest so that we can have more cases presented, but also compiling a case study that we aim to have a technical publication. So this, please get back to us, to our co-organizer, ICIWaRM, Alex, Will Logan, to my colleagues from UNESCO side. And the two fantastic presentations, particularly I was able to follow the first talk, which provided case study from Sri Lanka and from Bangkok, really provided the case studies of a CRIDA approach. And we would like to have those case studies included in the technical series that we want to publish. And hopefully, again, let's keep the faith that we will be able to have a physical meeting that originally we planned. Still, we aim to have that meeting in November towards COP26. So we will be able to have, I hope that we will be able to have more case studies presented, different case studies presented. By the way, we just finalized a policy brief, which we will also circulate to wider audience on bottom-up approaches to meet for your review that we will be circulating. We will have a launch ceremony with AGWA and ICIWaRM together. So in that sense, as presented by authors, with this climate uncertainty, with this modeling uncertainty, we really need to have those approaches that can be applicable in the local context. And then only we can provide tools, methodologies to member states so that they can meet the common goal, climate-related goal, sustainable development goal. So with that, I would like to thank co-organizer AGWA, the team led by Alex and all the other colleagues, Will Logan, director of ICIWaRM, and my colleagues, Patricia, Rita, Barbara, Clemarine, Lucille, who really was behind to make this success, and also thanks to the interpretation services. And please come back to us. Please submit your case studies so that we can have more cases presented to all over the world. I am very much, I can see that lots of participants from different regions of the world. And with that, stay safe. Thank you very much.